This happened during spring break of my junior year of college. I woke up trapped inside my own tent because someone had moved it while I was sleeping. Not dragged a few inches, not knocked over by wind, moved across an entire campsite with me still inside. And when I unzipped the tent that morning, all four of us were arranged in a perfect square around a tower of stacked stones that hadn't existed the night before. That was the moment we realized something had walked into our camp while we were unconscious. And whatever it was, it wanted us positioned exactly where it left us. This happened during spring break during my junior year of college. Me and my three closest friends, Kevin, Ollie, and Seb, decided to take a cheap camping trip deep into Colorado. We've been doing trips like this since freshman year, mostly because none of us could ever afford anything better. That semester, we were especially broke, so instead of paying for a campground, I searched one of those free camping apps and found a dispersed site somewhere outside Buena Vista. At first, the place looked perfect. The Forest Service road stretched for miles into the mountains, twisting deeper and deeper through endless pine trees until it honestly felt like we'd driven out of civilization completely. No signal, no gabions, no other cars, just trees and silence. The kind of silence that almost makes your ears ring. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. The campsite sat beside what looked like an old creek bed that had completely dried up years ago. The dirt was cracked and pale, and twisted roots stuck out of the ground like bones. Something about the place felt wrong. Not obviously dangerous, just abandoned in a way that made it feel like people weren't supposed to stay there long. But none of us cared at the time. There were no other campers, no fresh tire tracks, no fire pits, nothing. It felt untouched. We set our tents up in a loose cluster about 15 feet apart and spent the evening drinking cheap beer, playing cards, and making stupid jokes around the fire. Honestly, it was one of those nights that felt completely normal. That's what makes the next part so terrifying. Around 11 p.m., we all went to our tents and passed out almost immediately. And I mean completely passed out. That alone was unusual for me. I'm an incredibly light sleeper. At home, I wake up constantly from tiny noises or changes in temperature. Camping is even worse. Every snapping branch or gust of wind usually wakes me up. But that night, nothing. No dreams. No waking up. No memory of the night at all. It felt less like sleeping and more like someone had shut my brain off. When I finally woke up the next morning, something already felt wrong before I even opened my eyes. The air inside the tent felt colder, somehow, heavy, too quiet. Then I unzipped the tent flap and instantly froze. Every single tent had been moved. Not damaged, not collapsed, relocated. All four tents now stood in a perfect square formation around a carefully balanced pile of stones sitting in the center of the campsite like some kind of ritual marker. For a second, my brain genuinely refused to process what I was seeing. Each tent had been moved at least 20 or 30 feet from where we originally pitched them. But the worst part? The tent stakes had been pushed perfectly back into the ground. Nothing inside my tent had been disturbed. My sleeping bag was still zipped around my legs exactly how I left it. My phone was still plugged into my portable charger beside my pillow. Everything was untouched, except the entire tent itself had somehow been relocated during the night. I remember this horrible cold feeling spreading through my chest as I checked everything over and over again, try to prove to myself I was imagining it. Then I started screaming for the others to wake up. Kevin crawled out first, looked around once, and immediately went pale. I didn't even have to explain anything. He already knew. Ollie and Seb came out seconds later, and the expressions on their faces matched exactly what I was feeling. Confusion mixed with pure instinctive fear. None of us remembered anything after going to sleep. But then Ollie quietly said she'd had a vivid dream about walking through a massive empty desert while someone behind her counted every step she took. Slowly, like a command. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Then Kevin looked up and admitted he dreamed he was marching in formation beside soldiers while a voice shouted orders from somewhere in the darkness. Seb didn't remember dreaming at all. Neither did I. But hearing both of their stories sent this horrible feeling through the campsite. something suddenly felt wrong between all four of us. Connected, like we were sharing the same nightmare without realizing it. I remember looking back and forth between my friends and feeling this overwhelming sensation that someone else was standing there with us. Not physically, but somehow inside the space between us. Watching, listening. The best way I can describe it is this. It felt like there was a fifth person at the campsite, and none of us could see them. We started searching the area for answers. At first, Kevin tried rationalizing everything away, saying maybe we got drunk and moved the tents ourselves without remembering. That theory died instantly, because we found drag marks in the dirt. Long, deep trails leading from each tent's original location to where they now stood. But the truly disturbing part was that the marks stopped about 10 feet before each tent's final position, as if whoever or whatever moved them had dragged the tents most of the way, then physically lifted them off the ground, with us still sleeping inside. None of us said anything after noticing that. Then we turned our attention to the pile of stones in the center. There were exactly 4 rocks, one for each of us, balanced perfectly on top of one another with unnatural precision, like someone had spent hours arranging them. And underneath the bottom stone, scratched faintly into the dirt of the dried creek bed, was something none of us noticed at first. 4 vertical lines, and a 5th line carved straight through them. For a brief second, the pile of stones almost looked beautiful. If we had found it anywhere else under different circumstances, it probably would have seemed like some strange piece of forest art left behind by another camper. But standing there in that dead silent clearing, with our tents mysteriously rearranged around it like pieces on a chessboard, it felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Kevin stepped closer to inspect the top stone. He crouched down, leaned in, and reached out carefully like he was examining evidence at a crime scene. Then his boots slipped on the loose dirt. The entire stack collapsed instantly. The rocks clattered across the dry creek bed, breaking the silence like gunfire. And that's when everything changed. The moment the stones hit the ground, all 4 of us heard it. A low grinding rumble echoed through the forest. Not nearby, far away, but massive. The sound rolled through the trees like distant artillery moving underground. It wasn't thunder, and it definitely wasn't an earthquake. It sounded mechanical, ancient, like enormous slabs of stone dragging against each other deep beneath the earth. Like some buried door had just been forced open. Every hair on my body stood up instantly. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. Panic spread through the campsite with the speed of an electric shock. It felt like our brains were linked somehow, like fear itself was passing between us without words. I could feel Kevin's terror before I even looked at him. Ali's breathing became shaky. Seb had already started stuffing gear into his backpack without being told. The atmosphere around us had completely transformed. 2 minutes earlier, we were confused. Now it felt like we had accidentally triggered something. Something that knew we were there. We packed faster than I thought humanly possible. Sleeping bags got shoved into bags half folded. Tent stakes were ripped out of the dirt. Nobody cared about organization anymore. Survival instinct had taken over completely. The grinding noise continued in the distance the entire time. Slow, heavy, alive. Every few seconds, it seemed to shift locations, echoing from different directions through the forest like whatever was making it was moving around us underground. Realistically, we were probably out of there in under 5 minutes. But in my memory, it felt like an hour-long evacuation from a war zone. Nobody joked. Nobody argued. Nobody even asked questions. We just fled. I remember climbing into the passenger seat while Kevin threw the truck into reverse, so aggressively gravel exploded behind us. As we sped back down the forest road, I glanced behind us one last time through the rear window, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the middle of the campsite, perfectly still, watching us leave. To this day, I can't say for sure if it was real or if my brain was breaking under stress. Honestly, I don't like thinking about that night too much anymore, because the more I replay it in my head, the less it feels like a strange camping story, and the more it feels like we survived something we were never supposed to witness. That was 5 years ago. Life moved on after college the way it always does. Kevin moved to Denver after graduation. Ollie went to grad school in California. Seb eventually moved to Chicago with his girlfriend. We still text occasionally, birthdays and random check-ins mostly, but none of us ever talk about Colorado. It's like there's an unspoken agreement between us. Leave it buried, because deep down, I think all four of us are terrified that if we start talking about that night again, we might remember more than we're supposed to. My name is Simon, and what happened to me last summer feels connected somehow, even if I can't explain why. I was 23 at the time. My girlfriend, Cadence, and I had planned a camping trip for months. Just the two of us. No phones, no distractions, no outside world. We'd been together for about a year and a half, and things between us had quietly fallen into routine. Not toxic, not broken, just dull in the way long relationships sometimes become. So we figured a weekend alone in the woods might fix that. We picked a campground deep inside Uhori National Forest in North Carolina after spending weeks searching online for the right location. We didn't want somewhere crowded with families and RVs, but we also didn't want to be completely isolated either. The place we chose sat about 3 miles down an old Forest Service road. According to the reviews, there were only 6 or 7 campsites total, all spread far apart through the trees. Remote enough for privacy, close enough to feel safe. At least that's what we thought. We left Friday afternoon around 3 o'clock, stopped for supplies near the forest entrance, and reached the campground just before sunset. The drive-in felt like entering another world. The deeper we went, the rougher the road became. Loose gravel hammered against the underside of my truck, while giant pine trees crowded both sides of the path like walls closing in around us. By the time we rolled into the main clearing, daylight was fading fast. Still, I remember feeling proud of the spot I picked. The campground looked almost deserted. A few weathered picnic tables sat scattered around dying fire pits, and each campsite was tucked deep enough into the woods to keep campers from seeing one another. We slowly drove through the area, checking out the sites. Most were empty. One had a blue sedan parked beside it, but there was nobody around. Cadence eventually pointed toward the final campsite at the very end of the road, where the forest seemed to swallow everything beyond it. This one, she said immediately. The spot was secluded, surrounded by thick trees that blocked visibility from the rest of the campground. It felt private, hidden, almost too hidden. We spent the next hour setting up camp. Cadence was obsessed with organizing everything perfectly, so mostly I just followed instructions while she rearranged gear every 5 minutes. By the time we finished, darkness had settled fully over the forest. I got the fire going while Cadence made sandwiches, and for a while, the night felt exactly how we imagined it would. Peaceful. The fire cracked softly between us while we drank beer and sat quietly watching sparks drift into the trees. We weren't talking about anything important. Honestly, I think we were both just enjoying finally escaping normal life for a little while. Then around 10 p.m., Cadence got up to brush her teeth at the water spigot near the picnic tables. I stayed behind by the fire, poking at the logs with a stick and finishing my beer. That's when I noticed someone standing just outside the firelight, completely motionless. I nearly jumped out of my chair because I hadn't heard anyone approach. The man stepped forward slowly and apologized for startling me. He said his name was Aiden. He claimed he was staying alone at the campsite with a blue sedan and just wanted to introduce himself. He looked about 30, maybe older, but there was something deeply unsettling about him that I couldn't explain. The way he held eye contact felt unnatural, almost confrontational, like he was studying me instead of talking to me. Then Cadence walked back into camp. The second Aiden saw her, his entire expression changed. He smiled slightly and glanced around our campsite before saying, "Good choice picking this spot." Then he looked past us toward the dark woods behind our tent. Real secluded out here. The whole thing became even stranger when Aiden claimed he came out to the campground to avoid people, even though he kept showing up at our campsite like a ghost appearing out of the dark. And the second Cadence returned to the fire, I may as well have disappeared completely. Aiden's entire focus locked onto her. Not casually, not flirtatiously, obsessively. His eyes followed every movement she made, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stared at her without blinking much. Cadence noticed it too. I could tell by the tightness in her smile and the short, awkward answers she kept giving him. hoping he'd eventually take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He just stood there talking directly to her, while the forest behind him sat completely black and silent. Finally, I interrupted and told him we were turning in for the night because we planned on waking up early. That finally worked. Aiden nodded slowly, apologized again, and stepped backward into the darkness between the trees. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. No lantern. No phone light. Nothing. He simply walked into the pitch black woods like he already knew exactly where every tree was. Cadence immediately said, "Okay, that guy's seriously weird." I agreed, but at the time, weird still felt manageable. Annoying. Creepy maybe. Not dangerous. We stayed awake for another hour feeding the fire and trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling he left behind. Eventually, we killed the flames, zipped up the tent, and went to sleep. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. And the second my eyes opened, I knew something was wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out what pulled me awake. Then I heard it. Voices. Two people talking somewhere outside our campsite. Low, distant, calm, like a conversation happening just beyond the tree line. I turned toward Cadence. She was still asleep beside me, completely unaware. That protective instinct kicked in immediately. I wasn't about to sit frozen inside the tent wondering who was outside, especially with her there. So I slowly unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and leaned my head out into the darkness. The voices stopped instantly. Not faded. Stopped. Like whoever had been talking heard the zipper move and went dead silent. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. I grabbed my phone, switched on a flashlight, and scanned the campsite. Nothing. The beam swept across the fire pit, the picnic table, the truck, and the surrounding woods. Empty. Either whoever had been there already left, or they were standing further back in the darkness watching me without making a sound. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was overreacting. It was still a public campground after all. People stayed up late drinking and wandering around all the time. Maybe voices just carried farther in the woods at night. So I crawled back into the tent and forced myself to sleep. I never mentioned it to Cadence the next morning. There didn't seem to be any reason to scare her over what could have been nothing. The next day actually felt normal. We spent most of it hiking through the forest trails, and honestly, it was fun. For a while, the weirdness from the night before faded into the background. But by evening, that feeling came back. The air itself felt tense somehow. As sunset approached, I walked over to the truck to grab more firewood from the pile we stacked nearby. That's when I saw something tucked beneath the windshield wiper. A folded napkin. At first, I thought it was trash blown in by the wind. Then I unfolded it, and my blood ran cold. Written across the napkin in shaky handwriting were 4 words. "You should move your tent." I stood there staring at the message for several seconds while my mind tried to catch up. Then I immediately brought it to Cadence. The second she read it, her face drained of color. "Aiden did this, didn't he?" she asked quietly. I didn't even hesitate. Who else would it be? The timing alone felt deliberate. The voices during the night. The strange behavior. The way he kept appearing silently out of nowhere. It had to be him. As we stood there trying to decide whether we should confront him or leave immediately, I suddenly heard footsteps crunching across the gravel. And almost like the forest itself had summoned him, Aiden appeared again. Same clothes, same expression, same unnerving eye contact. The second I saw him, fear and anger collided inside me. This time, anger won. I snapped at him harder than I probably should have, telling him he needed to stop sneaking up on people and leaving creepy notes on our truck. For a second, he just stared at me silently. Then he apologized in this low, rough voice and said he was only trying to check on us. That answer only made everything worse. Before I could say anything else, Cadence asked him the obvious question. Why would you need to check on us? And what he said next completely changed the atmosphere. Aiden glanced toward the woods before answering. Quietly, like he didn't want the forest itself hearing him. He said he was surprised to see people our age camping out there alone because strange things had been happening in that area for years. Weird disappearances, abandoned campsites, people leaving belongings behind in the middle of the woods with no sign of where they went. He said sometimes hikers found tents deep in the forest with food still sitting out, but nobody around. No footprints leading away. No explanation. Just empty campsites slowly being reclaimed by the trees. I didn't trust him. Not completely. But the terrifying part was how sincere he sounded. There was no dramatic storytelling. No attempt to scare us. He spoke like someone explaining bad weather. Matter of fact. Then he told us something that made my stomach drop. He claimed he heard people walking around his car the night before. Not one person. Several. Slow footsteps circling his campsite for hours. And according to him, every time he looked outside, nobody was there. That's when he told us he planned to leave before sunset. And that we should do the same. At that point, neither me nor Cadence argued. We started packing immediately. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. Cadence's hands were visibly shaking while she shoved gear into the truck, and honestly, I wasn't doing much better myself. The entire campground suddenly felt hostile. Too quiet, like something was waiting for nightfall. We finally finished packing and pulled out of our campsite, just as the last sunlight disappeared behind the tree line. But as we drove past Aiden's site on the way out, something caught my attention immediately. His blue sedan was still there, which made no sense. I slowed the truck and looked over. Aiden was crouched beside one of his tires in near darkness, completely still. I rolled down the window and asked him what he was doing. Slowly, he looked up at me. Aiden slowly stood up from beside the car, then stepped backward into the fading light. That's when I saw the tire. A massive slash ripped across the rubber from top to bottom. Not a blowout, not an accident. Someone had cut it open deliberately. For a second, nobody spoke. The forest around us had gone completely silent again, and the only sound was the ticking of my truck engine idling on the gravel road. Aiden looked down at the tire and muttered, "Holy hell." But there was something strange about the way he said it. Not shocked exactly, more like defeated. Like part of him already knew this was going to happen. Even now, years later, I still replay that moment in my head, wondering if he genuinely needed help, or if we were already walking into something far worse. At first, Aiden asked if we could give him a ride out of the forest. Before I could answer, Cadence leaned close and whispered, "Don't." Her voice was shaking. I could feel genuine fear coming off her at that point, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something about the entire situation was wrong. So I apologized and told him we couldn't take him with us. Aiden just stared at me for a second. Then he nodded slowly and asked if I'd at least call the police once we reached cell service. I told him I would, and then we drove away. My headlights cut through the dirt road as we left the campground behind us, throwing long shadows between the trees. The forest looked completely different now, darker, tighter, almost claustrophobic. Neither me nor Cadence spoke. We were maybe 100 yards down the road when I glanced toward the woods on my right and saw them. 3 figures standing silently between the trees, about 30 feet off the road. They weren't moving. They weren't hiding. If anything, it felt like they wanted us to notice them. For a split second, the headlights illuminated pale faces and dark silhouettes, standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence. Watching the road, watching us. A cold shock shot through my entire body. I slammed on the brakes without even thinking. To this day, I honestly don't know why I did it. Maybe part of me wanted to go back for Aiden. Maybe my brain simply couldn't process what I'd just seen. But before I could make a decision, Cadence grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and screamed. Drive. Not panic yelling. Not nervous. A real scream. Pure survival instinct. So I hit the gas. The truck fishtailed on the gravel before shooting down the road, while branches whipped past the windows like claws reaching into the darkness. I checked the mirror once. The figures were gone. Cadence didn't say a single word for the entire drive back to the highway. She just sat there staring straight ahead, trembling. The second I got cell service, I pulled onto the shoulder and called 911. I told the dispatcher everything. The campground, the slashed tire, the people in the woods, Aiden being stranded alone out there. They said they'd send someone to check on him, but we never heard anything after that. No follow-up, no update, nothing. Part of me still feels guilty about leaving him there. Sometimes I wonder if Aiden was telling the truth from the very beginning. Maybe he really was trying to warn us. Maybe he knew something was out there long before we arrived. Cadence always insisted he was part of it somehow, that the whole thing was staged to scare us or lure us deeper into the woods. Maybe she's right, but deep down I don't think so, because when I looked at those three figures standing between the trees, they didn't look human. Not completely. And whatever was out there that night, I still believe Aiden was just as afraid of it as we were. This next story happened 2 Mays ago when I was 28, and unlike the others, I went looking for isolation on purpose. At the time, I was working remotely as an IT consultant out of Bozeman, Montana. The job itself wasn't anything special, but it paid well enough, and the freedom to work from anywhere felt like the only good thing left in my life. 3 months earlier, my marriage had fallen apart, and I was handling it terribly. Nothing seemed to help. Therapy, drinking, staying busy, none of it worked. Every day felt exactly the same. Wake up miserable, go to sleep miserable. Eventually, I convinced myself the only way to reset my head was to disappear for a while. Not metaphorically, literally. I wanted to go somewhere so remote that there would be nobody else around for miles. No phone signal, no people, no reminders of my old life. Just wilderness. Camping had always been a huge part of my life anyway. I grew up scouting with my father and spent years learning survival skills in the backcountry. I never made Eagle Scout, but I knew enough to survive alone better than most people. So one sleepless night, around 2 in the morning, I started digging through obscure camping forums online, looking for truly isolated spots in Montana. That's when I found it. An old backcountry forum filled with posts about unofficial campsites hidden deep inside Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. The kind of places that didn't appear on maps. The kind of places people only shared through word of mouth. Looking back now, I should have listened to the part of my brain telling me that was a horrible idea, but I didn't. The next morning, I started planning the trip immediately. I only told one person where I was going, my brother, and even then, I kept the details vague. Just a rough description of the area in case something went wrong. I had plenty of PTO saved up from work, so disappearing for a week wasn't difficult. By Thursday, my truck was fully packed. I brought enough supplies to survive comfortably for over a week. Freeze-dried meals, water filters, emergency medical gear, spare fuel, batteries, survival equipment, and my Remington 700. I'm not some hardcore gun guy, but you don't hike alone that deep in a Montana wilderness without protection. Out there, you're not the top predator. The drive took around 4 hours from Bozeman. The first half was easy. Highways turning into county roads turning into old Forest Service routes. But the deeper I drove, the worse things got. Eventually, even my GPS gave up trying to understand where I was and kept rerouting me in circles because the road I needed didn't officially exist anymore. After nearly an hour of backtracking and comparing old online directions to landmarks in the forest, I finally found what looked like an overgrown trail hidden between thick trees. It barely resembled a road. Twice I had to stop and physically drag fallen branches out of the way just to keep moving forward. Even with my truck's 4-wheel drive, I started wondering whether I'd be able to get back out once the trip was over. Finally, the trail became too narrow to continue, so I shut off the engine, and the second I stepped out into the silence of the forest, I knew I'd found the place. The deeper I pushed into the Montana wilderness, the more it felt like I was driving off the edge of the world. No signal, no roads on the GPS, no signs of civilization left behind, just endless forest swallowing everything in sight. When I finally killed the engine and stepped out into the silence, I was almost certain I'd found the location from the old forum posts. Not that there's really a right place that deep in the wilderness. Out there, every direction feels equally abandoned. Still, the area looked perfect. A wide clearing sat just beyond the trees where I parked, flat enough for a campsite and surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was exactly the kind of isolated spot I'd been searching for. Except, there was already a tent there. I noticed it almost immediately. An old olive green canvas tent stood near the far edge of the clearing like some forgotten relic from another decade. The thing looked ancient, easily from the 80s or earlier, and it had clearly been sitting there for a very long time. The fabric was stained dark from moisture, and mold crawled across the seams thick enough to see from 20 feet away. At first, I assumed another camper had somehow found the same coordinates online, but something about the tent felt wrong. Not abandoned recently, abandoned permanently. I should have walked away right then. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly and called out a friendly hello into the trees. Nothing answered. No movement. No sound. Not even birds. The tent flap hung slightly open already, so after hesitating for a second, I unzipped it the rest of the way. The smell hit me instantly. Jesus Christ. It was one of the worst things I've ever smelled in my life. This thick, rotting stench that punched me in the face the second the tent opened. Like something had died inside months ago and been left to liquefy in the heat. Every instinct told me to back away immediately. But by then, my curiosity had completely taken over. Holding my breath, I looked around inside the tent. There was an old sleeping bag, several empty soup cans scattered across the floor, and a small notebook lying near the corner. That was it. No clothes, no backpack, no signs of whoever owned the place, which made the smell even harder to explain. Something in that tent was rotting, but there was no body. I reached in, grabbed the notebook, and got the hell back outside before the stench made me vomit. Once I caught my breath, I flipped through the notebook, and that's when things became truly unsettling. Every page was filled with tally marks, hundreds of them, carefully organized in groups of 7. Page after page after page. Nothing else. No names. No journal entries. No explanations. Just tally marks. The final page contained 42 full groups. Over 8 months worth. At that point, I still wasn't truly scared. Honestly, I felt intrigued more than anything else. Like I'd accidentally stumbled onto some weird backcountry mystery nobody else knew about. After a while, though, there wasn't much else to investigate. So I kept the notebook. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Leave it there? Then I set up my own camp on the opposite side of the clearing, far enough away from the old tent to feel comfortable, but still close enough that I could keep it within sight. For some reason, I hated the idea of not being able to see it. As the evening went on, I explored the surrounding woods trying to get familiar with the area. And that's when I noticed something strange. There were no signs anyone had ever camped there before. No fire rings, no trash, no footprints, no trails, nothing. I hiked for hours and didn't find a single trace of another human being anywhere nearby. It honestly felt like I was the only person left alive for miles. That night, the sky was unbelievably clear. I remember lying outside my tent for a while, staring up at the stars because they looked unreal out there. Without city lights, the sky almost seemed crowded with them. Eventually, exhaustion from the drive caught up with me. I crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out quickly. Then sometime deep in the night, I woke up, instantly, wide awake. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew one thing for certain. Something had woken me. I'm an extremely heavy sleeper, even outdoors, so the fact that I snapped awake that suddenly told me immediately something was wrong. I stayed perfectly still inside the darkness of my tent, listening carefully. At first, I heard nothing. Then finally, whispering, multiple voices, 2 or maybe 3 people speaking softly somewhere outside my tent. Close, maybe 20 feet away. I couldn't understand the words, but I could hear the rhythm of conversation. Quiet, calm, like they were discussing something while standing just beyond the campsite. A cold sweat broke across my back instantly. When you go that deep into the wilderness, specifically to be alone, hearing unknown voices outside your tent in the middle of the night becomes horrifying very quickly. I stayed frozen inside my sleeping bag, pretending to still be asleep. After a few seconds, the whispers stopped, but the silence somehow felt worse. Then I heard footsteps, slow footsteps circling my tent, not walking past it, circling it, like predators testing a cage. My hand immediately reached for the Remington beside me, and thank God it did, because less than 2 seconds later, somebody grabbed my tent zipper and yanked hard. The clips I'd attached held it shut. Whoever was outside paused briefly, then started scratching at the side of the tent. slowly, deliberately, like they were trying to cut their way through the fabric. That's what finally pushed me over the edge. I raised a rifle directly toward the tent flap and shouted that I was armed, and they needed to back the hell away immediately. The scratching stopped. Everything went silent. Then suddenly, footsteps exploded through the woods. Multiple sets, running. At least 3 different people scattering in separate directions through the trees. That part terrified me more than anything else. Not only were there multiple people out there, they weren't together. They split apart like they already knew exactly where to go in the darkness. I barely slept the rest of the night. I sat awake, gripping my rifle, while every tiny sound outside made my heart hammer harder against my ribs. Finally, morning came. The second sunlight touched the clearing. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside while making a very obvious show of carrying the rifle openly. And the very first thing I looked at was the old mold-covered tent. The first thing I did when the sun came up was look toward the old mold-covered tent, and my blood instantly turned cold. It was gone, completely gone. Not collapsed, not moved, gone. I walked across the clearing in disbelief to where I knew for a fact it had been sitting the night before. There was nothing there. No flatten gras, no tacones, no depression in the dirt. It was as if the tent had never existed at all. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had stared at that thing for hours the previous day. I walked inside it. I'd held the notebook from inside it in my own hands. And yet now, the clearing looked untouched. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling creepy and started feeling genuinely dangerous. Then I noticed the footprints. Bare human footprints surrounded my campsite in a massive rough circle about 20 feet out from my tent. There were dozens of them, different sizes, different depths, some small, some large, enough to confirm that there hadn't just been 1 or 2 people outside my tent during the night. There had been several, and some of the footprints were pressed so deeply into the soil, it looked like whoever made them had stood there motionless for a very long time, watching, waiting. A trail of prints led toward a massive pine tree near the edge of the clearing. Against every survival instinct screaming in my head, I followed them, and that's when I saw the marks carved into the bark. Fresh tally marks, deep enough that sap still glistened around the cuts. 7 groups of 7, and the beginning of an 8th, exactly like the notebook. I just stood there staring at the tree while this horrible realization slowly crawled into my brain. Someone had been counting days out there, for months, and now fresh marks had appeared overnight directly beside my campsite, like my arrival had become part of whatever this was. I didn't want to think about what that meant. Honestly, I still don't, but things got even worse, much worse. As I backed away from the tree, trying to process what I was seeing, my eyes caught something hanging from a low branch a few feet away. At first, I thought it was garbage. Then I realized it was an animal. A dead squirrel, strung up carefully by fishing line. Even now, years later, it remains one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life. And I'm not squeamish. I hunt. I grew up gutting animals. Blood and dead wildlife don't bother me. But this was different. The squirrel wasn't hanging naturally. It had been posed, deliberately arranged in a way that felt intentional, almost ritualistic. Its body twisted unnaturally toward the clearing, as if it had been positioned to face my campsite specifically. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. The whispers, the circling footsteps, the scratching on my tent, the tally marks. This wasn't random. Someone had been watching me, and that squirrel wasn't decoration. It was a warning. I didn't waste another second. I practically sprinted back to camp and started tearing everything down as fast as I could. My hand was shaking so badly, I kept fumbling with straps and zippers. And every few seconds I'd stop and whip my head around because I was convinced someone was standing just beyond the trees watching me pack. The forest felt wrong now. Not quiet, waiting, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Every snapped twig made my pulse spike. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like movement. It felt like I'd stumbled into territory I was never supposed to find. Eventually, after what felt like an hour of pure panic, I got everything loaded back into the truck. Then I ran for the driver's seat. Literally ran. Part of me fully expected to discover my tires slashed or my engine tampered with. But somehow, the truck was untouched. I threw it into reverse immediately and started backing down the narrow, overgrown trail. And honestly, that drive out was one of the worst parts. Backing through that tight forest path felt like trying to escape a trap that was slowly closing behind me. Branches scraped against the truck. Mirrors clipped leaves and bark. Every few seconds, I checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone stepping out into the trail behind me. But I never saw anyone, at least not clearly. A few times, I thought I noticed movement between the trees pacing alongside the truck deeper in the woods. Dark shapes moving parallel to me. Too fast to identify. Maybe paranoia. Maybe not. Eventually, I made it back to the main road. And only then did I finally feel like I could breathe again. When I got home, I considered calling the police. But the more I thought about it, the more pointless it seemed. What was I even supposed to report? A disappearing tent? Whispers in the woods? Tally marks carved into trees? Nobody was going to hike miles into remote Montana wilderness to investigate a story that sounded borderline insane. So I stayed quiet. But to this day, one image still keeps me awake sometimes. Not the footprints, not the whispers, not even the scratching on the tent. It's the squirrel, because nobody hangs an animal like that unless they're trying to send a message. And I honestly believe that if I had stayed one more night out there, I would have become the next tally mark.